involved with City City right at the end of 2010, and that's been I think a very formative and fulfilling, if I can put it like that. Not in the sense of I feel good about it, but what sort of the trajectory I was on as a pastor and minister has been just accelerated and strengthened by being involved in City to City. So we're talking a bit about Gospel City Vision, and what I want to do is suggest to you 3 axioms about movement to reach a city. The introduction will say a few things about cities, and then 3 axioms. And if you want to remember something from the talk, you could remember these axioms. It takes a movement to reach a city. Secondly, no one church, network, or denomination can be a movement. And thirdly, the pace of a movement will rarely, that's just a nice way of saying never, exceed the expressed unity of Christian leaders in the city. It takes a movement to reach a city. No one church, network, or denomination can be a movement. That's by definition. That's just a God-given thing. And thirdly, the pace of a movement will rarely exceed the expressed unity of Christian leaders in the city. That leads to point 4. We talk about a city, and it's interesting, even as we use the language of the city. I don't know where that comes from. I think it kind of comes basically from New York, because I always loved, Sex in the City was a TV show you might know. And they talked about the city a lot, and so we've sort of taken that on, talking about the city. Gauteng is Johannesburg and Pretoria and everything in between, and only 16 odd million people. I think partly where I want to land this is make the very brief suggestion that is not a thing. It's a thing in your imagination, but it's not really a thing. It's many, many things. And I want to suggest that not only at a sociological or political level, but more importantly at a missiological level. And so that when you think city, I'm going to suggest that you think missiologically about what I call sub-city. If you take on the word sub-city, that'd be great, because I couldn't persuade my own team in Australia to take on the word sub-city. They've gone for the extremely, descriptive local area. But there you go. In Australia, we are seeking to reach and connect movement with 26 million people over the course of the whole of Australia. So Gauteng is not far short. I mean, it's 3/4 of the country of Australia. My point is, our vision for movement along the lines that I'm going to talk to you about is for the whole of Australia. In other words, for more than Gauteng. And so I'm going to suggest that it's applicable, it's actually mappable at some level for you. And as I've said to the preaching lab, what I tend to do in these presentations is I just put it out there. I'm not going to, I'm going to give a proposal for what I would suggest you to think about, which is another nice way of saying do, right? Don't just think about it. But then you do with that what you like. So just a brief thing about the importance of cities. Really interesting, the Hebrew word for city in the Bible just refers to a human settlement with a wall, right? And there was a reason for that, which was because there weren't police forces or armies. And so the way that you made people safe was not through those sorts of institutions, but through a wall. And what that led to, because you had a city was walled inside a protective environment, that led to 4 things in particular. And this, I think, is a useful definition of what a city is: density, diversity, economic growth and empowerment, and mixed land use. Density, everyone's in close proximity to each other, and the more people come in because it's safer to be there, so you get a much greater density. The alternative to a city, of course, is, in our context now, the suburbs, and beyond the suburbs, a kind of agrarian context. In the old days, in the Hebrew context, it was just the country or the city, the agricultural, agrarian context, or the city. And cities, therefore, are much higher density of people. One of the really interesting things that leads to almost directly is diversity. Because once you put a whole bunch of people together, some of them are going to be different from other people. And so there's always the question in the context of a city of how to handle and manage diversity. And of course, you in South Africa have the question of diversity right at the top of your agenda. It's kind of unmissable. I think that's getting increasingly the case. Almost all cities around the world are increasingly diverse, and the question of diversity is not one that anyone can ignore anymore. Thirdly, the question of economics. which is to say putting people of diversity into a dense kind of context of a city simply drives an economic engine that moves things forward. It's not accidental that economic progress over the course of human history has gone hand in hand with urbanisation over the course of human history. Those two things go together. People put together who are different, have different ideas, different opportunities, different entrepreneurship. They work with each other. There's competition, which makes everyone better. And so there's an economic part to the urbanisation that is taking place with the development of cities. And then finally, typically cities, especially big cities, centre cities, and quite what you define as a city becomes one of these sort of interesting, but in the end, I think, relatively futile discussions. There's typically mixed land use. In Manhattan, for example, the avenues, they're the big fat ones that go up and down, right along the spine of the island, the great big wide ones. They've got commercial space all up and down with retail on the bottom. On the streets, which are the thinner ones that go across, they typically have apartment blocks for residential with retail on the bottom. So what you've got in Manhattan is residential right up next to retail, where you go and buy something, right up next to commercial, that is where you go to work. In the suburbs, for example, to contrast, what do you have in the suburbs? Really boring houses. Just lots and lots of them, street after street of houses, with the occasional, we have in Sydney at least, a corner shop, a little corner shop. Now, that's all being changed in even as these things develop. Corner shops are being forced out because collections of suburbs will find themselves having a mall, right? And so there'll be a mall, which is a great big thing with lots of parking, so that in the suburbs, because it's all spread out with housing, you've got to have a car, and public transport routes head towards the centre city, right? And so you need to get around with a car, and you go to the mall, and then you go back home and go to sleep, because that's what you do in suburbs, is sleep. So mixed land use is typical of urbanisation as well. What's happening in urbanisation? Well, check this out. That is urbanisation over the past 500 years. So virtually no one lived in a city worldwide in 1500. And there's a reason for that. Technology had not advanced to mean that food production could permit a majority of the population to not be involved in frontline food production. Just everyone needed to be out there on a land, growing crops, and maybe having some extra to sell. But over the last, particularly since 1900, you can see that urbanisation has taken off enormously. And although this has got Japan, which is extremely urbanised, Australia would be about the same as Japan. Australia is a funny country, massive, great big desert the size of the Sahara, right in the middle, and a tiny little group of people all around the outskirts, on the edge, highly urbanised from its beginning. You can see the red line is the world, and that's up now over 50%. So over 50% of the population are now living in cities with all of the opportunity and all of the challenges that cities provide. And by the year 2100, that'll be up, I think it's predicted to be somewhere between 75 and 80%. It's absolutely massive and unstoppable. In Africa, it's estimated that in 1900, about 89% of inhabitants lived from the primary occupations of farming, hunting and gathering, cattle nomadism and fishing, meaning that 11 or less % were urban. That's 1900. Start of the independence period in 57, 14.7% of African were urban. 2000 risen to 37%, expected to rise well above 50% by 2020 when this was written. So Africa is participating in this urbanisation story every bit as much as the rest of the world. And of course, Africa is the demographic future of the world. Most of the world's population have an inadequate net reproduction rate for all sorts of cultural reasons. People are not having children, and in particularly Western countries, populations are falling off a cliff. There are some countries, but by 2100, that'll be half the population that they are now. And the one place that's not happening is Africa. And so even the reproduction rate of Africa has come down significantly, but still to, I think it's 4 point something. And so the African population will continue to grow enormously, and in the not very distant future, Africa will have some of the biggest cities in the world, many of them. And that's just a really fascinating part of the story for Africa. And what all this means, of course, is that Christian mission can't ignore cities. Christian mission can't ignore cities and must reflect the particular context of density and diversity and the economic, particularly what emerges in the cities, not only economic growth, but also economic inequality and disparity. And Christian mission can't ignore cities and adapt itself to the particular needs of cities. And so in a city-city context, we have this diagram that I think is just quite a useful depiction of how it is that cities can be missioned. I think in the 20th century there was some ambivalence about cities, and the thought really was that what Christians did when they went to the city was hold their breath. Right? You go to the city, hold your breath for 3 years or 4 years while you did your degree if you went there to study or to do some work to get experience, and then get back home to where good Christians can be, which is in the regional or particularly suburban sort of contexts. But that's no longer possible anymore. And so what is it to do Christian mission in cities in particular is to have these three aspects: church multiplication, collaboration of leaders, and city engagement. And so you can see right here is something, I mean, really very parallel to what the Gauteng Alliance is trying to do, right? It's right in front of you. Collaboration of leaders, and that picks up on the diversity question. The unavoidability of diversity in a city context means that will include in a church context. There will be a diversity of churches. And therefore collaboration of leaders to join in a trans-denominational collaborative multi-network coalition is crucial for a mission to cities. That will lead to then two things: church multiplication, creative, multiplying and contextualized church planting, replanting and revitalization. So that's, on the one hand, that's the spiritual, if you like, mission of the church. But then thirdly, it has to include city engagement, which is to say multiple healthy models of collaborative efforts of individual churches and agencies and organisations to respond to the needs, or as one of the things we describe this with our leader of this sort of effort is to respond to the tears and the pain of the city. And if the churches are healthy and multiplying, both in church planting and revitalisation, and are able to reach out to and respond to the tears and the pain of the city, then this thing can become an enormous spiral that works together. And at the heart of it, at the beating heart of it, has to be gospel renewal. Has to be gospel renewal. It's only gospel renewal. It's only the reality of the grace of God in the cross of Christ, reordering the loves of our hearts, just filling us and changing us and deepening us and enabling us to be so secure in who we are that we can be connected to people who are different from us. That's diversity. Let me say that again. So secure in who we are that we can be deeply connected to people who are different from us. Did you notice the implication that I made there? A little bit of a poke. If you're not comfortable with people who are different from you by being close to them, guess what's happening? You're actually not very secure in yourself. It's only a really secure person who's able to genuinely connect with people that are different and diversity. And when there's that gospel renewal taking place as the engine room, then it's possible to have a collaboration of leaders and church multiplication and city engagement in this way. So that's the importance of cities, and I'm going to suggest these three aphorisms. They come from Tim Keller, and he says the first one: it takes a movement to reach a city. I want to just make a brief comment about movement. Movement's a very trendy word at the moment. Everything's a movement. My YouTube channel is a movement, and my denomination's not. We have denominations that have renamed themselves movement, and movement's a word that is just, I think, overused now, and in particular used imprecisely. So let me suggest there are three kind of angles of approach on what movement is. Mostly people mean movement as simply dynamic or fast growing and multiplying. In which case, anything can be a movement. Nike can be a movement, or Taylor Swift is a movement. In fact, I think we had Taylor Swift out in Australia recently, and people talked about the Taylor Swift movement because, boy, those concerts were fast growing. A lot of people went to those concerts. So if that's what you mean, then it's worth knowing that, and if that's what other people are saying, let's be aware that if they just mean fast growing, then let's just call it what it is, fast growing. Secondly, movement can mean loosey-goosey structure. Movement as opposed to institutionalized. Okay, and so the classic example of movement as loose, bottom-up, vision-driven, not power or institution-driven structure is AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a kind of a program. It comes out of the big book, and it can, anyone, anywhere, without needing any permission, can just start an AA group. And thousands of them, tens and tens of thousands of AA groups are planted. They have actually residencies. No, they don't have residencies. They just go start AA groups, and people go to them because addiction's a terrible problem in our world. And so that's that. No, you're not accountable to anyone. You don't ask anyone's permission. You just go do it. That's movement as loosey-goosey structure. Or then there's movement as a goal, which is to have the gospel growing faster than the population with increasing spread of shalom. So the goal, movement as goal, is to say we are a movement when the population growth in Australia is about 1.5% per year, which you think, well, that's not much, but actually do that on 26 million people over 10 years and it's a huge amount. In Africa, the population growth is much greater than that. Does anyone know what the 3 or 4% would be my guess, which just is massive, massive. So movement, and particularly movement of the gospel, will take place when the growth of the gospel in the church is growing faster than the population. And because we, the church, are in for the long haul, we're here till Jesus returns, all you've got to do is keep adding 1 decade on another, 1 century on another of growing faster than population growth. And what happens after all of that time? Jesus wins. It's kind of cool, right? So that's movement. But notice, with increasing spread of shalom that goes with it. With increasing spread of shalom that goes with it. So all I'm doing here is just noting that movement can be used in different ways, and you need to be just clear on what you mean by it. I'm commending actually all three at the same time. Fast growing, really welcoming of ideas and leadership, and not stifling, not no structure, but not all structure, not suffering what Tim Keller used to call institutionalitis, terrible virus, institutionalitis, ruin anything. But thirdly, with a goal. So it takes a movement to reach a city. Secondly, no one church, network, or denomination can be a movement. Let me say a little bit about this. I think this is worth just resting in for just a moment or two. What is a network or denomination vis-a-vis a movement? And what I want to suggest is that a network or a denomination, and this is particularly what denominations used to be, the decline of denominations in being this is what has caused the rise of networks. So what a denomination typically used to be, or what a network is now, is the embodiment of a particular DNA, or I'm going to say a little more precisely even, a particular theological vision. Theological vision is, again, a city word, it's a Tim Keller word, and it's the recognition that he made that between doctrine, foundational doctrine, and ministry, practice, or expression is this other thing, this set of glasses that we don't look at very often because we always look through them. And I don't know if my eyesight's getting worse and worse, and which means but I'm vain, so I don't wear my glasses very often. But when you take your glasses off, if you've got really bad eyesight, you can't see your glasses anymore, can you? Because you need your glasses on to be able to see something. My son, when he was younger, was long-sighted, and he had these bottle-thick glasses that he used to wear, and he could hardly see a thing without them. And so if he tried to look at his glasses, he couldn't see anything because he needed his glasses on to look at anything. He looked through his glasses. And Tim Keller says there's this thing called theological vision, which we don't often look at because we need it to see anything. Theological vision is the prism through which doctrine is refracted into practice. A denomination used to be, and a network now is, birds of a feather who are flocking together. Do you know that phrase? Birds of a feather who are flocking together because they have a shared theological vision. And you feel it. You feel this. You feel it when you go to a group of people that have the shared theological vision with you, and you just feel comfortable. You know that you don't have to be cautious and explain everything because everyone understands what you're saying and gives you the benefit of the doubt if you say something a bit weird, because they know that actually you didn't mean anything a bit weird. You're just in the team. When you bump up against a group of people or someone who has a different theological vision, you just don't have that level of comfort. You know that you have to be careful. You've got to be cautious. You've got to phrase things really carefully. There's some topics you don't go near. Right? At a denominational level, you just don't raise the question of baptism if you're amongst Baptists, because they'll get really interesting. So what a denomination used to be was a group of people who embodied a particular theological vision. When denominations declined in that, and there was too much diversity in a denomination, but they didn't want to split, so they just allowed it. And so denominations head off in different directions with different people. And the role of denominations shifts a little bit to become more property management and authorization of ministry, ordination, you can do this. Networks emerge because we need other birds of our feather in order to flock together. That's what a network is. Now remember, the claim is no one denomination or network can be a movement. Why is that? Why is that? The reason for that is that the people in a city of enormous diversity will find affinity with only some of them will find affinity with a particular network with a particular theological vision. And so a denomination or a network will reach a certain point at which it is unable to continue to grow as part of the mission of Christ in a city. Another word for networks is tribes. And so we have tribes in Sydney and within Sydney Christianity, and different tribes. And what I'm saying here is that's okay. You need to have it. You have a theological vision, and so you find your tribe. Tribes are okay. Tribalism is not. Tribes are okay. Tribalism is not. And what is tribalism? Tribalism is the conviction that my theological vision is the only legitimate, God-honouring, faithful theological vision. Which by definition, if that's the case, means what I have to do is just shoot people from other tribes. And I don't know if you have this in South Africa, Christians generously critiquing other Christians. Does that ever happen here? Or other sorts of versions of that, like just lobbing bombs onto each other, one to another, endlessly criticize. That's all about tribalism. That's all about theological vision. That's all about thinking that my theological vision is the only legitimate one. But when you don't recognise the concept of theological vision, the way that you phrase that always goes to the biggest nuclear bomb that you can find, which is theology itself. But mostly, it's not about theology. mostly the fights that we have are about theological vision. And what I'm suggesting is that no one tribe, no one network, no one denomination can be a movement of the gospel in a city as we've just defined it, or taking all those three things, because the city is too diverse. And therefore, if there's going to be a movement of the gospel in any city, then there will be discomfort. Why? Because it means you're going to have to get up close and personal and collaborative with people from other theological visions, with people who embody a different theological vision from yourself, people who are part of a different tribe. It means there needs to be an acceptance, and in fact, the acceptance is too weak a word. There needs to be a celebration of them. One of the things Tim Keller does about this is to suggest that we can take Paul's image of the body in 1 Corinthians 12, which is about an individual church, and by analogy, apply that to a whole city. So in a city, there'll be churches that are like, big toes, and they're just big and strong, and they do one various thing. And there'll be other churches that are like kidneys. And what Tim does with it is to just take up what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12, which is the big toe can't say to the kidney, I don't need you. And the kidney can't say to the big toe, I don't belong. And that the body of Christ in a city has all of those same temptations of exclusion or inferiority, all of those same temptations in a city that Paul seeks to solve with the body image, to say, no. Actually, the way the body works is many parts, one body, and in particular, we all need each other. And you remember how the chapter finishes? It's the least presentable bits of the body, guess what they get? The most honour. Wouldn't it be great if the body of Christ in a city operated like that? Not just internally to each church, but even between churches, because there's a church of God in Gauteng that understood, I'm a kidney and you're a big toe and we're different. And sometimes there's even a bit of fungus on that big toe, and someone's got to cut it off, and the fungus, not the big toe. And I'm not pretending that there aren't problems and real issues at stake here. But in the end, it's a game changer to see ourselves as the body of Christ in the city. And that will imply action. It'll be very important for a collaboration of different churches and different networks to be action-oriented. So I'm going to leave that point there. And then, so it takes a movement to reach a city. No one church, network, or denomination can be a movement. And I hope you got a bit of a sense of that. And therefore, which means we have to celebrate others. You have to celebrate difference. That's very rare these days. In our context in Australia, the church is so much like the culture. The church is just as polarized as the culture is, and it's a disgrace. Point 3 then, the pace of a movement will rarely exceed the expressed unity of Christian leaders in a city. And so Tim, at the conference he came to Sydney, suggested that Christian ministers carve out 15% of their time to meet with people outside their tribe. Can you imagine if pastors across Gauteng spent 6 hours a week fellowshipping with, getting to know, praying with, drinking coffee with people outside of their network, outside of their tribe, just building a web of relationships across the city? 15% of the time. That would be a game changer. Finally, and I'm aware of the time, and I'm going to finish with this point, I just want to raise the question that I mentioned before, which is, city or subcity, which is to say, missiologically, cities don't really function as wholes. Missiologically, cities don't really function as wholes. Rather, they're a collection of sub-cities. This is just a great, it's a bit rude, but it's just a fantastic picture that a student newspaper in Sydney did that divided up Sydney, same Sydney, but according to different parts of Sydney. So there's the rich North Shore, there's the snobby eastern suburbs, there's the hip and trendy progressive inner west, and there's the extremely boring racist Shire. Okay, and so Sydney, according to the Shire, right down the bottom right-hand corner there, you see it's got the eastern suburbs, which are all those sort of progressive, that's Satan, they're terrible. And the inner west where I am, they're all a bunch of socialists. And the conservatives up on the North Shore are sort of rich Anglo brother. And everyone west is just a bunch of refugees. And what's funny is, it's not funny. The people in the Shire actually think like that. And at the same time, the people in the inner west over here, which is where I live, see, what do we think about ourselves? Cultured. And you know what? That's very true. We are very cultured. We quote Shakespeare to each other. The people down in the Shire, right, because the Shire over here thinks the Shire, which is down south, it just is Australia. And what does everyone else think of the Shire? Bogans, bogans, and bogans. Now, you can get it from the word, right? It's onomatopoeic, bogan. Just unsophisticated, retrograde, 19th century bogans. In the inner west, just south of the inner west is, do they even have small bars? Because that's what we have. We're hip and trendy. So now my point is not so much the perspective. It's just that everyone, wherever you're from, divides the city up in the same way. They just give it different labels because those labels are real. I mean, so those divisions are real. They really apply. My point is that's not just a sociological phenomenon. It's a missiological phenomenon. The mission to the bogans of the Shire just has to be different to the mission to the progressives in the inner west. Why? Because the idol structures of the Shire compared to the inner west, the nature of their loves, their fears and their hopes and their sadnesses and their joys, the things that they put in front of Jesus are different in the inner west than they are in the Shire. And if you proclaim the gospel in the same way to them, if you try to interest them in the gospel by the same means, that it will fail. It will fail. So what this has led us to say in Australia is that we don't need 7 movements of the gospel in the cities of Australia. We need 200 movements of the gospel in all of the sub-cities of Australia. I'm suggesting you don't need 1 movement of the gospel in Gauteng. You're going to need 150 to 200 of them. Now, what's interesting about that is, it turns out, when we begin to think about this, it's kind of crazy. Right now in Australia, we have 70 groups like this meeting in 70 sub-cities in Australia, planning how to reach their sub-city for Christ. And it's possible to do that. It's possible to do that. And I'm not going to say any more about that. I'll leave that just as a question for you to reflect on. Missiologically, how do you divide up Gauteng? How does that work? Missiologically. Conclusion, the goal of gospel movement is gospel saturation leading to city transformation. Back to this diagram again. It's got both the heart of it is a gospel renewal. It comes through a collaboration of leaders from different tribes, which is only that gospel renewal will enable and empower, which leads to both church multiplication, planting and revitalisation, as well as city engagement. And so to suggest a goal of that in the very long term is that a tipping point takes place in gospel saturation when there's one healthy church per 1,000 residents. And the reason that's a tipping point is that Jesus becomes unavoidable at that point. Unavoidable. And city transformation is increasingly possible that adorns the gospel of Jesus. So I'll finish there. I'm aware that lunch, I think, is arriving, and just leave that for your reflection within your context about what it is to have a city vision for gospel transformation. Thanks so much.